Good morning and welcome to Women's Wednesday Entrepreneur Series hosted by the Women's Business Center. I'm Brandy Stitt, the Program Director for the Women's Business Center, and we're very excited that you are joining us. This session is part of an ongoing weekly webinar series that we will be hosting throughout the year. This session is the third of 6 HR-related topics that we will be focusing on. At the end of this session, you will find a link to the webpage for the upcoming webinars that we're hosting. So feel free to check those out and hopefully you'll be able to join us for future sessions. I am happy to go ahead and introduce our presenters for today. Erica Brune and Danielle Bearden are going to be leading us in a discussion on unemployment, layoff, and furlough. So I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Erica.
Good morning. Thank you. Trying to see, we're not seeing my screen yet. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Good morning. My name is Erica Brune, and joining me today is Danielle Bearden from Lever1, and we are going to take a deeper dive into the topics of managing your employees and your workforce through unemployment, layoff, and furlough. We've talked a lot about what's going on in today's business environment through the COVID pandemic, I should say. And today, one of the most complex topics is how to adjust and work with your employees if you are in a position to need to conduct a layoff, termination, or furlough. What's going to be right for your business? How do you even make these decisions? How you communicate to the employees? And most importantly, what can your employees do on unemployment, collecting benefits, other federal subsidies that are available to them through this pandemic, and really the care and concern that we as employers can give our employees so that they have the resources they need. On the flip side, we're also going to be talking about recalling staff. Many people have gone through a layoff and have already begun to reopen and recall employees. There is a very sophisticated process that's complex and also needs to be really thought through from a compliance and potential discrimination perspective and lens that we need to look through when we're making these business decisions with our workforce. And we're going to be discussing all of that in a deep dive on this one particular topic in today's 1-hour presentation. To give you a little background on Danielle and I am the president and founder of Lever1. Lever1 is an outsourced HR company that provides services to 120 plus businesses in the Kansas City market and throughout the nation. We service over 3,500 worksite employees of all different industries. So the topics that we're drawing our information from and the resources that we have to share with you transcend every industry, vertical, and size of business. And we're going to cover and address those concerns for you. And joining me today is my HR director, Danielle Bearden, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Yeah, thank you. We're happy to be here. Again, my name is Danielle. I serve as the Director of Human Resources for Lever1. Really just focusing on strategic planning, total rewards, labor relations, HR compliance, kind of you name it, we oversee it. And we have lots of a plethora of resources in which we lean on to help us along the way and to help serve our clients the best we can. So operating in nearly all of the states here, you know, we really depend on useful resources, and we hope we can be one of those for you today.
Thank you, Danielle. Let's jump right in. We've got definitions, differences for unemployment. So tell us what is going on and what are the options in today's work environment?
Yeah, so as we all know, legislation focused on really assisting people and businesses throughout this pandemic. And as it continued to grow, the unemployment benefits were greatly expanded for those individuals that were kind of caught in the tide of this. But essentially, just to break it down, unemployment insurance provides compensation for those workers who lose their job through no fault of their own. Monetary payments are provided routinely for a specific period of time and then differ from state to state um, as we go through with the different organizations. The only requirement for being eligible for unemployment is to be out of work, right? And so, but in order to be eligible, a worker must meet certain criteria, and that is mandated by each of the states.
I was going to say it can be loss of job in total or reduction in wages or hours, correct? Because some people have just fewer shifts, right? Because the business isn't open as many hours.
Yep, so you're absolutely right. So one of the things going into this, whether it be reduction in hours, reduction in some pay in some circumstances, you know, there are cases where you can file for partial unemployment and then follow the state's rules and guidelines on what you need to do to obtain that. Today in particular, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about the unemployment benefits and compensation that can be available to us or those workers through the CARES Act that came out in mid-April through the United States Department of Labor as well, just gave out some further guidance on that. But essentially, there are three portions of this CARES Act for the unemployment programs that really helps those individuals who are in need. So the first one provides an extra $600 a week in benefits for those individuals who are without work through no fault of their own, and specifically related to this COVID pandemic. The second one extends the eligibility for your unemployment benefits by up to an additional 13 weeks. And while the third provide unemployment benefits to those independent contractors, gig workers, self-employed, where we didn't originally see those before.
And I think it's important to note that every state does have its own threshold, and every state has its own compensation structure. So there's not just one amount of unemployment that people can make. We know we're on the state line here, so we have probably many participants on this that are on the Kansas side and that are on the Missouri side, or that they may work in one state and live in the other. Danielle, which state do they need to be looking at and focusing on in terms of what we're talking about today?
Yeah, you file your unemployment in the state where you had the job, right? So if you live in one state and work in another, such as what you had said, file in the state in which you had the job. Most states do allow the online or by phone filing. You know, if you lost your job, then move to another state, the same rule applies in those circumstances. But another often question we do get is, you know, what information do I need to apply? When should I apply? When you apply for unemployment, you'll need to provide information that identifies you and your last employer. Go on to each state-specific website, and depending how long you've worked at your last positions, you may also submit information about your previous employment. It will walk you through. I think the best piece of advice when we're talking about how to file is just to make sure you take the time to read the application in its entirety. We often find applicants who were denied benefits just because they missed one field, or maybe something wasn't as detailed as they needed. And as we knew, with the influx in unemployment, getting to that representative and speaking to that representative was really cumbersome to try to get. So if you're just piece of advice to take the time to really make sure you've answered as thorough as you can that application so it doesn't get kicked back for something that could have been prevented. But also want to touch on what you had said, you know, can you file a claim if you're working part-time or if your hours were reduced? mean, if you earned less than your weekly amount for any claimed week, you might be eligible for those partial benefits. But again, each state has their specific guidelines, and we weigh on those for determining such.
Okay, thank you. Let's dive into the different types of options an employer has. What is furlough?
Yeah, so businesses are seeing significant revenue losses, right? And it's just where we are today, and it's where we have been for a little bit now. And so they're faced to say, okay, what options do we have? And very often, you know, I don't know about you all, but I heard a lot of people learning about the term furlough for the first time, you know, and what does it mean, and what options do we have as employers with the significant revenue loss? So one of the options we talk about, and it's actually one of the most used options, depending on your circumstance, would be the furlough. It's considered an alternative to a layoff. You can either have employees working fewer hours or have a certain amount of unpaid time off, but those employees are still active in your system. So for example, an employer may furlough its non-exempt employees to 32 hours a week rather than 40. Or an employer may require all employees to take a week or 2 or 3 of unpaid leave throughout a period of time in that year. When some things to consider for furloughing of exempt individuals is that, you know, they're still continue to be paid on a salary basis under the FLSA. And so if they work any bit in that week, they have to be paid accordingly to that. So cutting the hours of the exempt individuals may not be the strategic place you'd like to go when it comes to that option of furlough. But maybe the unpaid time off is for that period of time. Being that employees are still active in the system and active for all intents and purposes in a business as an employee, they also still keep their benefits. And so that's something to consider. You know, can we ride out that storm and still cover our portion of employer benefits and the employee still providing their cost of the premium, to avoid having to go through all of the steps and the processes to rehire that individual should circumstances change and get better. You know, for the theory really with the furlough is to have many of your staff share the burden rather than 1 or 2 individuals being laid off as we speak. So again, sometimes furloughs are the best option for those that can't afford them, just so that, you know, it saves time on the back end with trying to rehire those individuals.
Excellent. And then on the opposite end, you could do a layoff. And that seems to be a little bit more common.
It does. Pros and cons to both. A layoff is that temporary separation from payroll. So your employee is not going to be active in that system, or in your, as an employee, they're going to be inactive. But because there's not enough work for the employee to perform. The kicker here with layoffs, though, is the intent is still to recall that person, to get that staff member back to work, right? And so important to keep in mind when we're going through the layoff process, you're still hopeful that this condition will change. And I think that message is uber important to share with your staff and your workforce, that this isn't you know, all ending type of thing initially. We fully intend to recall you back when work becomes available. And typically you're able to collect those unemployment benefits while you're on an unpaid layoff. And sometimes, if you can afford it as well, in this case, some employers will try to maintain your benefit coverage, at least maybe for like a defined period of time. We've seen maybe a month or so, you know, when it comes to that. But when you're talking layoff, you are inactive. You are not an employee, but the intent is still to bring you back.
Okay. And then the reduction in force, is this a third option, or is it just part of the, you know, if you're doing a layoff or furlough?
Yeah, I wish I could say it wasn't a third option because I don't like this one, but it is. It is. This is something that's saying, hey, we're in a bad way, and this position is just going to be completely eliminated. We don't intend to replace it. We don't intend to recall. It's a permanent cut in your head count. So if you have a restructure in your organization, or if you experience such extreme revenue losses that you just can't overcome, and you know right from the get-go that this position, I'm just going to reallocate those tasks out, this is an option that we look at, and often sometimes referred to as being RIFT, or also termination. There's no intent to bring that position back. And oftentimes what we see happening is, okay, we get a layoff and the intent is to still recall them, right? And now it's just, as you know, we're in the middle of uncertain times. And while our intent was pure and wanting to recall that position or those positions, we just can't overcome it, and we're not seeing the revenue like we had hoped, right? So very often, sometimes that layoff will turn into a reduction in force, and that's saying we're never going to replace that position by means of attrition there.
Okay, so I get a lot, hey, Missouri is an at-will state. Why do I even need to tell my people if I'm doing furlough, layoff, or reduction in force? You know, a lot of people have been advised to not really give a reason. Obviously, HR professionals typically feel differently. What's your take on that? And why is it so important to be specific and clear on which of those three that you're doing, certainly in today's environment?
Yeah, gosh, I have lots of answers for this. Lots of reasons. And I should, or else I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. The first reason is going to be to make sure that you have documented a consistent practice and proof of what it is that you're doing for those means of fair treatment, claims of retaliation, allegations of discriminatory practices. Our list of protected classes are forever growing for those individuals that, you know, are a minority. So to be able to show that you've taken the steps and you have legitimate business purposes to back you up on those. The more documentation and thoroughly thought out paperwork you have just backs up your business structure and your purpose for doing what it is that you're doing consistently and fairly. And I really stand by that, because if you don't have that paperwork to support, you know, the consistency and the fairness, word of mouth only gets you so far sometimes. And so the best practice in mitigating those litigation circumstances is to have that documentation. Another part of that would be, you know, when those individuals will be filing unemployment. And what do they have that they can take with them? What do they have that they can provide to that unemployment agency in that specific state to help them through that? Oftentimes states will ask for that documentation to have and to keep and to, you know, and to prove to them the circumstance that they're in. And, you know, it's important to keep in mind the at-will states, you know, sometimes that goes both ways too. You know, the employer has rights just as long as just as such the employee does.
So on furlough, layoff, and reduction in force, whichever is right for the business, it does not impact the employee's ability to collect unemployment.
No, it doesn't. I mean, even for those individuals that are filing part-time, I mean, you could still file for and might be eligible for partial. I mean, so if you're not working through no fault of your own, it's completely attributable to the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, whether you're furloughed, laid off, you may still be eligible for those unemployment benefits. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to move into, all right, now I understand what my options are. I need to start moving forward. How important is, and why do we need to focus so much on who we're selecting?
Yeah, so selection criteria is one of the #1 things that you can make sure that you have documented to safeguard your business structure and your decision making. When we have a selection criteria, and that is used amongst the workplace and distributed accordingly in our decisions, we are not, that's reducing the chances of having a bias or unconscious bias from your management staff or your ownership groups. It's saying we have a list of how we're selecting, and this is how we're going to do it. It has no weight on how I feel about Jane Doe. It has no weight on how I feel about Mr. Bob, but this is the criteria we're going to use that's going to work best for our workplace. Important to also remember, this doesn't completely wipe out your chances of, you know, or forecasting any type of lawsuits when it comes to, you know, how you've treated or what the disparate impact, what we call it, of your minority staff. What that means is you really have to look at all of your staff, get all of their biographical information, come up with a selection criteria that's going to work for you. Make sure that protected classes or minority staff groups of individuals that are protected aren't adversely impacted. And then you're going to consider the inclusion of a layoff and recall policy. So that policy is going to tell you, the employer, how you're going to do this, and then the employee what they can expect.
Okay.
So when we talk about the selection criteria, this list is not exhaustive, right? You can certainly kind of spin it to what works for your organization. Some very common ones we see are going to be length of service with the company or tenure. You know, such phrases as first one in, first one out, right? And so a lot of organizations will choose that just across the board, like, you know, that it is what it is, and that's the groundwork we're going to lay as we move forward. The needs of the company or specific projects. You know, you may have one individual on a project, and because of COVID or the pandemic, you know, that those projects aren't operable anymore. And so you could choose that selection criteria as you go through. Okay, this employee still has their projects and they're still up and running. This one does not, so there's just not a need there anymore. You could do it by past and current performances and where they are. If you're going that route, I always make sure that you've got your documentation to support you in that area. You know, very often, sometimes when we look at layoff and we're saying, okay, well, let's look at our people that aren't performing. Well, if we don't have the documentation to support that they're not performing, it's going to kind of put you in a pickle because you need to be able to provide, you know, the documentation and the proof that that's what you're using to make your decision, and a sound one. Okay. You can also do skills and education and all that fun stuff, as long as it's done so consistently.
So what's, you know, obviously we've got the potential for layoffs or business volume that weighs on employees, but also there's the just contracting the illness or being sick. And so can you talk about what, you know, what are you hearing from the employees? What are they experiencing that they may not feel comfortable sharing with their employer?
Yeah, my goodness, like the staff, I can't imagine, or I can't imagine because I'm doing it, we're working through it, but their heads are spinning. Not only are they worried about their jobs, their families, their well-being, their family's well-being. Maybe they're a caretaker of someone who's contracted or been in progress, their child care. Not only are they worried about all that, they're worried about their job. Am I going to keep my job? Am I going to lose my job? Then what? Am I going to qualify for unemployment benefits? What, you know, I think the good rule of thumb here when it comes to communication, and I know we touched on this pretty greatly last session that we had as well, is the more communication, the better. Being able to communicate with them helps them feel connected. Very often I see staff members who don't hear anything and they feel that there's something fishy going on, right? There's something that they're not hearing. Is the organization getting ready to make a tough decision? Is my job at stake? The more communication, the better when it comes through this. Provide information. Here we are this week, right? Thank you for your dedication. Here are some things that are going on in our business. Here's what we're doing to continue to keep you safe. steps that we're taking, accommodations that we're making for those individuals who might be at higher risk, or caring for, you know, a child or dependent with no child care available. And empathize and listen. You know, I always love to use listen to learn. And sometimes I think when we get so busy as we navigate through daily tasks, we're listening to get to the next thing. And I think in this case, taking a breather and listening to learn, hear what they're saying so that you can address the emotion before addressing the problem. Important to remind on the benefits that are available to your staff members. So not only do you want to hear and listen to what their concerns are, but how can you help? I mean, everyone's human, and a very common phrase I'm seeing in the HR world today is putting the humanity back in human resources. And what does that mean? And reminding them that you're here to help them. That's what you're here for. So I think we can all lend, you know, a shoulder and listening ear at this time and really adopt that mentality. Remind them of the benefits you have, whether it be an employer assistance program or some extra resources at work, maybe some support groups you may have, maybe some support groups you're thinking about implementing or utilizing. Really just being creative, keep their morale up, keep their spirits up. You know, now's your time to really focus in on what makes them them. And something that I had mentioned the last session we gave, or maybe it was the one before that, is, you know, we had an opportunity as managers and staff alike to kind of go through this pandemic together. And we now have a level of bonding that have come from that. You've seen one another's homesteading, maybe their pets, their children, their spouses. You have gone through something that I hope we will never go through again, but you have that immediately built relationship now. What are you going to do with it? You take it and you foster that and really support those, lastly, that are still in the workplace. Okay, you have those individuals working remotely, but how are your people feeling that are back on your workplace? Are they feeling safe and sound? It's your job to remind them as much as you can that you hear them and you want to keep them safe. Their safety and well-being is your priority.
So let's say we've laid off 5 people, layoff, furlough, reduction in force, whichever applied to us. We've laid 5 off, 5 are off of work. How does the medical insurance and other benefits apply to them through the layoff period?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the biggest overall risk here is that claims will be denied, right? But what we wanted to establish is your eligibility for COBRA or any other assistance program here. You know, if you're furloughed or you're laid off, you could potentially be eligible to continue that coverage. That would be considered a qualifying life event. It does differ when it comes to fully insured plans versus self-insured plans. You know, some carriers might allow employees to remain covered for a certain period of time, even if they're not actively working. Each carrier is a little bit different, especially when it comes to the fully insured plans. But beyond this, insured plans are limited to what they can do or what the carrier will allow. If you find that you're in a self-insured plan, these have often much more leeway when it comes to knowing of the furloughs or the stop loss by the carrier. There tends to be more play in those areas.
Even the businesses that don't technically have to offer COBRA due to their employee count, there's also something called state continuation of coverage as an option as well. So my recommendation would be, as the employer, to call your agent and get an understanding prior to conducting the layoff, asking what your plan allows and having that paperwork prepared so that that employee has that at the time of the layoff. If you're an employee who has potentially been laid off, you can call the number on the back of your card as well to the carrier directly and ask what your options are. So those are some good options, because it is all designed within the plan document. And so helping you get your hands on that information would be through either the broker or directly calling the carrier on the card if you're an employee looking for help. Do you want to talk a little about employee assistance plan that's available to many employers and their employees?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really passionate about this. An employer-sponsored employee assistance plan, or an EAP, is a work-based intervention program designed to identify and assist employees with a wide, vast array of resolving personal problems, whether that be marital, financial, or emotional, whether that alcohol abuse or substance abuse circumstances. They also may offer adoption assistance, finding assistance for your elderly individuals, wellness programs. It's wonderful. What the most wonderful portion about it is that it's complimentary to the staff members. It's free. It's free. And so they just have to be in touch with the number associated, and it's confidential. You get a lot of plans will offer maybe 3 therapy or counseling sessions annually for a staff member. And then the list goes on. And so I'm a big proponent of an EAP program. I think it's a fantastic opportunity and a benefit to offer staff, and something to look into further if you find that you don't have one and you'd like to incorporate one. A lot of organizations have jumped on this and have added it to their staff offerings.
Fantastic. All right, now we're going to move on to some of the additional benefits that are available to the employers through the CARES Act that was passed, specifically with some tax credits. And this is a very complex situation, but we do want to just touch on it briefly to remind employers that if you're not quite ready for the layoff or the reduction in force, but you do have people that needed to or need to stay home for a variety of reasons due to the coronavirus. That could be they're caring for children that have no access to school or care. They are caring for an immediate family member that has tested positive, or they are seeking diagnosis themselves. And Danielle, you can probably add to that list, but there's a set criteria. If you have employees that are not able to work because of a qualifying reason for the coronavirus, there are tax credits available to the employer, meaning that employee would still receive their payroll because they qualify for this new CARES Act credit, and the employer then would be able to take those wages and cost of benefits and subtract it from the payroll taxes on that filing. Again, it's a very complex process, but the reality is there is a mechanism so that you can pay the employees who are qualified for these leaves, paid sick leave or extended family medical leave, and receive immediate credit so that the employer is not out of pocket doing so. And we've been successful at setting up through our payroll system for many of our clients that have qualified for this tax credit. This would require a much more detailed conversation, but I just want to remind you that those are available if you have under 500 full-time employees, and many employers are not understanding or taking advantage of that. It's a benefit to the employee and it's a benefit to the employer. It's completely federally subsidized, and it is working. And so that is available for employers and employees if you fall under one of those situations. Danielle, anything to add on that?
Yeah, nope. I mean, perfectly put. It falls under the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, also referred to as the FFCRA. It provides emergency paid sick leave or an expansion of the FMLA to your qualified individuals of staff. Again, if you are at 500 full or part-time employees at that threshold or below. And if you find someone falls under or qualifies for either of those two under that act, either the paid sick leave or the expanded FMLA, you have to then pay them a certain amount of wages. And you can get credit for those wages that you've paid them, just as Erica said. So if you haven't looked into that yet, please do, because that provides some immediate relief when you're running the payroll on that side.
And what's helpful about this solution is many times employers needed to be of a size to even be required to do paid sick leave, or certainly FMLA. Mm-hmm. This applies to the smallest of employers. And so it's an added benefit for the smaller businesses as well. It's not something that you have to be over 50 employees to qualify for. So do check that out. All right, let's say, Danielle, now business is picked back up, or maybe I've qualified for the PPP loan, or, you know, I'm ready to rehire and recall employees. And we're hopeful that we're seeing today, we're seeing more of that. Who knows what will happen in the future? We do have a little bit of fear of what some people call a second spike, or we have a little bit of fear this month that as the PPP loans have begun to expire and run out, that that we may see an additional reduction in force or layoff for certain industries. But primarily, we're not seeing that yet. We are seeing that people are recalling, that businesses are reopening, and this is different depending on where you are in the country. But we are working with a lot more recalls than we are layoffs right now. So let's talk about how do we go through the process of bringing people back? Maybe I can only bring one back today and two next week. And what are the rules surrounding the recall policies?
Yeah, very, very similar to that of the layoff policy we were talking about. What is your selection criteria going to be? And is it going to be utilized consistently, fairly, across the board to your workplace? And then being able to be sure that, you know, no one group of individuals is going to be adversely impacted. I kind of thought from the get-go that the recall process might be a little stickier than the layoff as we went through this pandemic. You know, I kind of felt like, you know, not only are individuals really yearning for their livelihood and the well-being of, you know, financially speaking, of their families and themselves on a personal and professional standpoint, but also those individuals who are claiming and, you know, gaining those unemployment benefits. Very often you might have a non-exempt staff, an hourly staff, who are making more on unemployment now than they would have in the workplace. And so how are we going to navigate through that? How are we going to get our staff back? And how do we get back up and running? And that is for sure what we're going through as of today in the past several weeks. You know, every state has been very different, as you said, and navigating through the different phases and the different industries. But the selection criteria can be used the same exact as the layoff criteria, whether that be based on tenure, performance, skill set, experience, history, project, very similar as long as it's done consistently there. Performance review ratings, you know, all of that. And then you have that layoff and recall policy that says, okay, here's the deal. We're going to recall you back if circumstances change. When we do recall you back, if you do not choose to come back, you know, we will accept that as a voluntary resignation, or we accept that as you are choosing to not work and come into the workplace. Now, where this gets sticky and a little hairy is when it comes to then who and whom qualify for unemployment then. Every state is so very different. And their stance on, you know, as long as we keep in mind those individuals who are not coming back, it cannot be for intents and purposes of just collecting unemployment. You know, I think in those purposes that's viewed as unlawful, and a lot of states have many guidelines against such practices. But returning to work, keep your selection criteria consistent, very similar to what we talked about for your layoff, and then make sure to have a layoff and recall policy that you're following.
So one thing we hear a lot about, Danielle, is I'm an employer and I'm ready to recall, but my employees are going to make more on, they're making more on unemployment with that additional $600 of federal supplement than I'm paying them. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah. So important to note here, and I think employers should keep on this communication stream with your staff. This is only for a period of time. Under the CARES Act, that extra $600 a week is only going to last you into the end of July, right? And so for some individuals, I think, you know, they're fine with that. But being able to communicate in a strategic way to the staff that lets them know that, hey, look, this job we're hoping to get back up and running and is back up and running. It's not going to end, hopefully, the end of July, whereas your extra 600 a week under the CARES Act will, as far as we know, because those circumstances are changing all the time too. But communicate all that you know to your staff so that they can be encouraged to come back. One of the best defenses is that accurate, well-documented evidence and making sure your choices and criteria were objective. But for those individuals wanting to just collect unemployment and not come back to work, in one case that may be construed as, unlawful, and two, it's only for a short period of time.
So what I'm understanding is that if you are an employer and you recall 5 employees, if 3 of them refuse to come back or resign, etc., you as the employer need to get online to your state where your business is headquartered and notify them that these employees have now refused work. It is unlawful to refuse work just to stay on unemployment. That is obviously a difficult situation because many employers are, sympathetic that these employees can make more money. But the reality of it is that it is unlawful to stay on unemployment for the purpose of collecting unemployment. It truly is there for those that do not have employment offered to them.
Yeah.
So it's a very, difficult situation, but the reality is there are laws surrounding it. So as an employer, once you lay off people, you are going to get an unemployment notice saying these 3 employees have applied for unemployment, and you mark and sign off that that is in fact accurate, that they worked for you and that they are laid off. The same is true for recalling them. As you recall them, and if they elect to resign, maybe they've obtained other employment, maybe they just are refusing and they don't qualify for any of these other paid leaves, then you do need to notify the unemployment office, and that is their instruction to us very specifically to notify them so that people cannot collect unemployment unlawfully. And they will catch up and collect from them eventually, but they are asking employers to be proactive in making those notifications so that they can manage the situation in real time and appropriately. Many employees have gone and found other work, and that's fine. Many employees don't feel safe to return to work. So Danielle, what's your advice on that? Some just say, I don't want to go back into a restaurant environment. I am fearful. I don't think that's a smart or safe thing to do. What is the employer's rights?
So case by case basis. And this is where your communication and your relationships that you've built through this is going to come into play and really benefit you. Having that relationship and that trust with that individual to talk about their circumstance. Everybody's circumstance is different. And so working with, if they are fearful of coming into the workplace, what can you do to provide them flexibility as we get through it? The more flexible an employer can be, the better right now. Of course, there's work to be done. Of course, we have to remain operationally sound. But the more flexible, and then understanding their situation. Are they at high risk of contracting COVID? Are they caring for an individual? Are they in a critical infrastructure industry? I mean, so many questions that we really have to dive into and ask, because as we know, when we're bringing back phases and we're mirroring it to that of what was rolled out from a federal standpoint, phase 1 and phase 2, we're going to make accommodations for those individuals who are at high risk of contracting the virus. For those who don't have childcare, that's what we want to try to mirror and show that level of empathy and discretion on a case-by-case basis. And so that's how we have navigated through each of those circumstances. If the individual does not work for critical infrastructure, is not an essential employee or an essential business, they're just purely fearful of contracting the virus, they're not at high risk, they don't have dependents to care for, no other circumstance in which applies, then we're going to look at okay, how is this going to play out? And every state's kind of different on their stance on that. You know, we hope it doesn't go into a separation of employment, but sometimes that's just unavoidable. And in those circumstances, when it is, what we like to say is, look, you're a value here. We love what you've added. We understand circumstances are just a little different. You know, we welcome you to come back if circumstances should change. And sometimes that's the only other option out there.
Okay, I've got, we are at the Q&A portion of this webinar, and I have several questions, but I'll remind attendees that there is if you toggle over your navigation panel, you'll see the chat feature. Please type in your question there and we will get that answered. So Danielle, here's some questions. How many employees have you seen that truly are refusing work? I know it was kind of a fear that people would prefer to stay on the unemployment benefit versus taking their job back. Is that a reality? Are you really seeing people say, I'm gonna cash in on this and not take my job back?
Yeah, that's a reality.
Okay.
And what we're seeing is, you know, the weight of it is really dependent upon the industry. Because as we see it, the majority of people or individuals in the workplace who are the greatest affected by this are your hourly individuals or your non-exempt individual staff members, right? And so very often, you know, they depend on that hourly work. And so what we're finding is, yes, they're just not wanting to come back because they're making more on unemployment. And then the employer wants to help them out as well. They want to say, well, I want to help them out because they're making more on unemployment. But the fact of the matter is, it's just unlawful if that's the only reason why. But we are seeing that trend, and more so in specific industries.
Okay. Another question is, the $600 extra unemployment money from the federal stimulus expires at the end of July. I hear there was talk that could be extended. Is that true?
Yeah, there's always talk. I mean, there's a lot of talk about different movements, maybe another stimulus, maybe another fifth CARES Act or what have you. Yeah, there's lots of talk right now. I think, you know, Congress and the Senate are, you know, back and forth with negotiating, but we don't know until we know. And sometimes that was one of the most biggest challenges as we were navigating and assisting our clients and navigating through this pandemic, is that we didn't know, and we were kind of at the mercy of the Senate and Congress and signing the bill into place. But I have heard, and yes, we have heard that that's still something being considered, but hasn't been rolled out.
I would agree. I would say there's very little talk about it right now, which leads me to believe it will expire at the end of July. Obviously, that could change. The piece that is unique to unemployment right now is employees are not required to be seeking work. Typically, prior to the COVID pandemic, employees to maintain and stay on unemployment would have to attest and sometimes in certain states show proof of applications that they were in fact seeking work. At this point, Danielle, correct me if I'm wrong, they are not required to seek outside work, and they may still stay on unemployment and collect the federal stimulus without even applying for jobs.
Yep, you're correct.
So there's two things for us to look at August 1 and forward, is if the $600 will be extended, and there is a possibility of that, and or will employees at that point need to start at least applying or looking for work? And that's where a lot of employers are struggling, is that, you know, it's one thing to help them out and raise the limit. It's another thing to say they don't even need to try and find work, as employers have jobs open and are struggling to get certain positions filled. Very difficult, of course, because like you said, every employee is in a different situation with their health and their fear and the environment, etc. So those are tough decisions that will still are yet to be seen for August 1st forward. Okay, I have one last question. If I laid off 3 employees, but now I need to hire a new position. So let's use the example of I have 3 bookkeepers, but now I need to bring in a CFO. am I required to recall one of my layoffs, or can I truly post for a new position and fill a different but yet moderately similar role?
First is going to depend on your policy. That's always what I'm going to go to first. What does your policy say if you have one? Second, you're going to really look at your workforce as it is, as it was, and where you want it to go. And so if you know those bookkeepers can absolutely not fill that role, whether they're lacking knowledge, skills, experience, what have you, and that's the way you're choosing to go as a business structure for organizational effectiveness, and that's the way you're going to go. No, you don't have any ties, but what I will say though is be very careful on adverse impact for those 3 individuals, and that you're not recalling back into the workplace. How are they going to be impacted? What does their biographical information look like? And on top of that, make sure you have a clear and transparent letter explaining that, hey, this is where we are. We're hoping to reevaluate in another 30 days, or we're looking at just permanently, reduction in force of your position. We're not looking to fill it back, but long answer, short, yes, if all of that.
So if I laid off 3 people, at what point do I need to contact them and say, it doesn't appear that we're going to need you back at all. This is a reduction in force.
Yeah, I think a good rule of thumb is to give it about 6 to 8 weeks. Still remaining in contact with those employees. I mean, the key to this is you want those staff to be available when you want to recall them. So to make a time period and say, I will reevaluate on that time period, at least gives them something. It keeps them, and you're not doing it in a devious way by any sorts or stretch, but that is just an uncertain period of time right now. So I think a good rule of thumb is 6 to 8 weeks for a layoff, and then determining, okay, whether or not we're going to sink or swim here and what we're going to choose to do as a business. But then on the flip side, another option is to, reevaluate in 3-week increments or 4-week increments, so that the staff member knows they're important and you are taking this serious, and you are reevaluating about every 4 weeks the circumstance. But that's the answer essentially to that. When it comes to furlough, we don't like to see that beyond 6 weeks.
Okay. And those are difficult because many businesses have now passed that 6 or 8 week mark and still are unsure about the future of their business.
Yeah.
So I like what you said, where then you reevaluate, but it sounds like communication is key to these people and understanding where they're at, and helping them understand where the business is at.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've answered all the questions. That concludes today's presentation. We do have additional Women Wednesday sessions, three additional weeks, Wednesday at 10 a.m. The link to register for them is on this slide. And we look forward to seeing you and joining you on our upcoming sessions. Everyone have a great day, and do not hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have additional questions that we can help answer. Stay safe.
Take care all.